So these are the difficulties that we do have. We have James in the New Testament, which also insists on following the law and speaks against justification by faith alone in James chapter 2. This is about the law, about the Christology. Stephen and Paul were from a different brand altogether. They were from the Hellenists, or Jews who became Hellenized. And the nature of Hellenistic monotheism was to some extent a little different from the monotheism as was strictly followed by more the orthodox circles. But Paul would take this further. And Paul in his writings would make Jesus as the agent of God's creation. You would have the one God, as Paul says, and you have the one Lord, and that one Lord is Jesus. So Paul here, he uses confusing language. Because in the Old Testament, it says, "Hear, O Israel, your Lord, our God, is one," in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. So there is a mention in there of the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So Paul sees here two mentions. There's a mention of God and there's a mention of Lord. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, Paul even explaining this and says, there is only one God and one Lord. So now he makes them two. He doesn't use God and Lord as two designations for the same person. He now uses them as though they are two. So he designates the Father as God and Jesus as the Lord through whom God made all things. This legacy of Paul, in fact, would be reflected to the way the Gospels are written. According to the majority of Christian scholars, they will tell us that the Gospels were written after Paul. We see Mark is the earliest to be written according to the general consensus of modern New Testament scholars. This consensus holds Mark is the first to be written. Then Matthew and Luke have apparently used Mark as their basis, and they would in their own ways improve on the materials in their own individual Gospels. We can see today, if you study Matthew and Luke besides Mark, you can see how stories have been improved along Christian lines in both Matthew and Luke. We can see development of the idea concerning Jesus. If Jesus appears weak in Mark, he appears powerful in Matthew and Luke. If he healed some in Mark, he healed all of them in Matthew and Luke. If he appears not all-knowing in Mark, he appears all-knowing in Matthew and Luke, etc. We see this episode after episode. Same event, but the episode has been modified, has been reworked. Of course, Matthew, Mark and Luke were not all writing at the same time. And they were not writing with the hopes that the same people will be reading their writings. They were all writing in different areas. It is in the 2nd century of Christianity that all of these documents were compiled all together into one book. And it would be in John's writings, which is the last gospel, that you will find a full reflection of the Pauline theology, that Jesus is the agent through which he created the world. And we find this from the very start. If you open up the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, it mentions that in the beginning was the Word referring to Jesus, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And through this he created the heavens and the earth. We have it here. There is a preaching of Paul of what we call a high Christology. And then we have the Gospels written over time after Paul struggling in some way to record the reminiscence of what Jesus was, what he did, and what he preached. But over time, that recollection itself receives modification until we get to the Gospel of John, where Paul's theology of Jesus, being the agent of God through which everything else is created, comes to full reflection. Of course, that is developed even further in the Council of Nicaea, 325 CE. Eventually, Jesus is declared is very God of very God. And the Chalcedonian Creed would eventually be developed from that and become the creed of mainstream Christianity. We can then see this development of high Christology in the writings of Paul. There might have been other people like Stephen and other Hellenists who preached a high Christology. But it is through Paul's writings that this has become a mainstay of Christianity, a teaching that we can't trace back to the true followers of Jesus because they don't have any writings that are definitely from them. The writings that bear their names are disputed in modern New Testament scholars. For example, 2 Peter is agreed upon both ancient and modern scholars that it's not from Peter. 1 Peter, it's divided. Some say it's from Peter, others say it's not from Peter. The letters of James is said not really from James, but one who sees himself as writing on behalf of James, some follower of James thought, for example. Now we come to the last of the 3 points. The theology of the cross. There's a book written by A.N. Wilson, a book entitled Paul, the Mind of the Apostle. He looks at the psychological background of Paul, where Paul grew up, the kind of Gentile background he had, the sorts of gods that were worshipped in his region, the way the sacrifices were done, how people bathed in the blood of the sacrificial bull, etc. And he, Mr. Wilson, thinks this probably contributed some way to Paul's thinking. Paul would have also have gone to the Old Testament, and he would have noticed with his Jewish training that the Old Testament had a lot of mention of sacrifices. And he, Paul, would wonder why all these sacrifices would need to be continued continuously. Does God need the flesh, the blood of these animals continuously? And does that really do any good? People are just as being bad as they have always been. Can there be a life-transforming experience? And what would be the basis of that? And then how can we explain the cross of Christ? Putting it all together, Paul came out with this conclusion, that Jesus did not die in vain. He became a curse for us. In a sense, the curse of God landed upon him, i.e. Jesus, instead of all humanity. So there is a good purpose for which Jesus died. And this will be eventually Paul's conclusion on that Jesus died for the sins of the world. It is to Paul's writings that we see this sort of theology all the time. For example, the wages of sin is death, and the gift of God is eternal life. We find this in Romans, in one of the letters of Paul. Whenever someone wants to prove or defend this theology of this atonement through the vicarious suffering of Jesus, they usually go to the letters of Paul. The Gospels written after him, in some sense, also cultivate this theology. But there too we find, in Mark chapter 10 verse 45, where it mentions that Jesus has come as a ransom for many. Now Matthew and Luke does not have this statement, that Jesus has come as a ransom for many. This may well have been that in the version of Mark, Matthew and Luke was working with, that statement was not there. And that in itself is a very difficult statement to explain. Some scholars decided to just simply ignore it. If he, Jesus, died as a ransom for many, that means he paid for the price for his blood so we can be released, true? But to whom did he pay the price? To the Father? In which case the Father appears cruel and unjust, taking the blood of his Son. Or did he pay the price to the devil, as some have said, as the price to let us go? But does that mean now we were enslaved by the devil and now he is on equal bargaining terms with God, demanding the death of God's Son, which ain't right either. With all of that difficulty, we see that if Christians, theologians, could find a way to de-emphasize this part of theology of Paul, then Christianity would be a lot easier to explain, I believe. And it would be more in line with Judaism and with Islam. So altogether, we see that there are 3 areas that Christianity is different from Judaism